I've been dealt a tough hand because I'm not as pretty as Gina, and I'm falling in between two spectacularly engaging people. So I feel a little bit like one of the filler tracks on the old Pink Floyd albums, and it's like you fall in between the ones, like you're one of the tracks everybody would really rather have skipped in order to get to the money. Okay, all right, anyway. So I got billed on the website partly as a poet, which is true. Poetry is a love of mine. I might shoehorn one into the talk at some point. Gina, we've got four littles, and we were chatting, some of us, before the start of this, and so that means, that means my pace of production is sort of reduced to the pace of a garden snail. So what I thought it would make sense to do today is to speak on a point. This is a little bit of like a life thought for me. This has developed and matured over 20 years, is maturing over 20 years. It's a point where my kind of vocational and avocational, my priestly, pastoral, and poetic callings meet, and that's the subject of what I'm going to use a term which I'll unpack over the course of this talk called spiritual art. So my title is Spiritual Art in Gospel Context. What does that mean? Well, let me unpack it this way, just by stating the thesis of this talk. You notice it's got something to do with art, something to do with God, something to do with how we know. So here's the thesis up on the screen. Spiritual art deliberately mediates God's fulfillment and judgment of the culture from which it springs, when and only when we, its makers, get our epistemology right. Okay, so I know now for something completely different, but this is what we're going to be talking about. I've numbered 3 claims you can see that comprise the thesis. Let me just give us a word on each. First, note that phrase, spiritual art. What do I mean by that? Well, I owe the concept of spiritual art to the Russian poet Olga Sedakova, who is marvelous. If you're a poetry reader, check her out, and the French historian Antoine Arjakovsky. For both Sedakova and Arjakovsky, spiritual art, what they mean by that, it's not a style like Cubism, Expressionism, or whatever. Neither, though, does spiritual art mean simply religious art, liturgical art, kind of kitschy Christian art, self-consciously sacred art, and so on. Rather, by spiritual art, I mean a byproduct, a result of a certain kind of intelligence. An intelligence that we articulate not just through media like words, light and verse, wood and clay. No, the intelligence that generates what I'm calling spiritual art is an intelligence articulated by nothing less than a certain way of being in the world. And this way of being provides the context within which artful ventures, or at any rate, artful ventures that are open to spiritual reality, may proceed. So the question that this concept of spiritual art invites us to raise is, well, then what is this way of being in the world from which spiritual art flows? Let me concentrate for a moment on 2 features. First, spiritual art is a way of being that is open to dynamic, personal engagement with the real. By the real, that's this philosophical language. By the real, I mean something like truth, being, reality, substance. And this means that spiritual art has to do with what the philosopher would call metaphysics or ontology, the science of being. So here's what I'm not suggesting. I'm not suggesting that if we are artists, if we are creatives, then we need to spend our evenings hunched over a metaphysical treatise. Okay, that's not where I'm going with this. What I'm suggesting is that the spiritual artist already finds herself in an encounter with the subject matter of metaphysics and ontology, namely reality, the real. What I'm reading about in the evenings, Gina is actually engaging with, okay? The really real. You see, reality, the spiritual artist understands, is personal, dynamic, delightful. The philosopher would say that the spiritual artist is a type of realist. That is, one who believes that there's objective reality with which we make contact, reality which doesn't dissolve into subjective inclination. To describe this Olga Sedakova, that poet, she puts a new spin on the old religious word asceticism. We think of asceticism, we think of self-flagellation, hair shirts, excessive fasting. But asceticism in Sedakova's sense, it's not about self-limitation, restraint, and so forth. It is about my bending to the real rather than expecting the real to bend to me. Now, novel as this may seem, this is a profoundly ancient thought. Now, nobody get nervous when I put Confucius up on the screen, okay? You'll see why I'm doing this. In his book, I really just did this so I didn't have to give you a picture of C.S. Lewis. I wanted something better. In his book, The Abolition of Man, C.S. Lewis presented the concept of the Tao, by which he meant, Lewis, of course, a Christian, by which Lewis meant the notion found East and West, Aristotelian, Platonic, Stoic, Christian, and Eastern thought, this thought that there is an objective value or an order with which our ideas, our thoughts, our affections can align and from which they can swerve. For Lewis, this was the great difference between ancient and modern man. Whereas the ancients sought to conform their thinking to reality, modern man, Lewis said, strives to adjust reality to his thinking. The roots of this shift, interestingly, Lewis traced to the Renaissance. Now, why the Renaissance? Well, because it was, Lewis pointed out, during the Renaissance that the combined study of science and magic made man no longer the delighted recipient of a freely given reality, which is what he was in the ancient and medieval thought worlds. The Renaissance, for all of its wonderful gifts, snuck in the cruel trick of deluding man into believing that he is the artificer, the fabricator of reality. And in that way, Christianity's elegant doctrine of creation was eroded. Let me just unpack that for a minute. The doctrine of creation says that God has, through one simple act, spoken forth being, the whole of history and the whole of time in an absolutely inclusive sense. The doctrine of creation is not about the first moment in time, but about the act of God that makes progression through time even possible. It's not about what creation was at the first moment of its existence, but what creation is at every moment of its existence. The inclusiveness of God's one act of creation, furthermore, means that this one act of creation both has occurred, so we read about it in Genesis, in Proverbs, in the Gospel of John, but also that it is presently occurring. So that in this simultaneously completed and unfolding act, this is unthinkable, it has been given to man, we who are mere creatures, to co-enact God's creation of the world. What a high and dignified calling for which we have been created, to be creatures whose creatureliness, we never cross the gap into being the uncreated, never ever. But our creatureliness finds expression precisely in what J.R.R. Tolkien called subcreation, our co-enacting of God's incommunicable act of creation. How glorious that is, how absolutely splendid that is, how inexpressibly exalted is this calling for which we've been made. Now consider the alternative furnished by the Renaissance. If we are not co-enactors of creation, but the very authors, sculptors, weavers of reality itself, as Renaissance thinkers held and modern secular thought now teaches, then we're not co-enacting God's creative act. We've not been lovingly caught up into his purposes. Why not? Well, because we no longer believe that we've received being. Why not? Because we no longer believe in a God who has spoken being into existence. From this philosophical breach emerge rival visions of the artist's vocation. Today, we're interested in the Christian one. Spiritual artistry, for the Christian especially, is a high expression of normal creatureliness. Artistry is, by God's gift, the activity of co-enacting with him the working out of the generous surplus of being he has spoken forth. It's the doctrine of creation out of nothing touching down in artistic endeavor. I think this is probably the place for me to shoehorn in the one poem I'm going to give you. Just skip it. All right. Thanks for that, Doodle. I appreciate that. All right. The title of the poem is Wind. And silence moans its aural step. Only after windswept fronds sound under skies of dying salmon. Before word-crafted light needles, fingers spade the edge of gift to moor the breathless climb. This rest proceeds from motion. All that is far more effortless than this, which nothing's being, that nothing may exist. This is a priestly act, artistry is. Mediating, as Adam was meant to do in the garden, the union of heaven and earth. Through artistry, heaven reaches down to earth like the rays of the sun falling on the fields, and through artistry, earth unfolds in response as the sunflower cranes up towards the source of its life. Spiritual art is priestly, mediating an encounter of earth and heaven. So the first feature of this way of being in the world, in it we are open to a dynamic personal engagement with the real. Second and more briefly, I'm not moving on just yet. Second and more briefly, this way of being in the world that I have called spiritual art perceives that reality is headed somewhere. Sedekova, the poet, describes spiritual art using the words eschatological and ecstatic. Both words express the point that the spiritual artist is oriented beyond herself. She thinks neither of She thinks neither of life nor of artful ventures as punctiliar events emerging out of a random sea of chaos. The spiritual artist is, as Sedekova says, eschatological, meaning that her artistry expresses the fact that she herself is ordered toward an end goal, a telos, a final cause, a spiritual destination. The same point is made by Antoine Arjakovsky, that historian I mentioned. Spiritual art, he writes, I love this, is a particular way of living by producing forms oriented towards their higher purpose. Now just note, underline there, the idea of working with forms, the association of producing form with purpose. And I think that's key. Forms express the idea that we are headed somewhere. According to the theologian Richard Villadesau, form is what makes a thing intelligible. Form is what enables us to differentiate this thing from that thing. When we delight in form, we are delighting in that which makes existence possible, and thus we're implicitly affirming, Villadesau says, the goodness and joy of existence and of being itself. So think about that the next time you feel tempted in one of your artful ventures to scrap all constraints and all limitations. Giving form echoes God's words at the beginning. Tov, tov, tov. It is good, it is good, it is good. These two marks of spiritual art deserve, I think, our careful reflection. It delights in dynamic personal engagement with the really real, and it aims at a spiritual destination, prejudicing its maker to prefer order to chaos. Combine those features, and the result is a way of life that is radically attentive to the real, a way of life in which we adopt a posture of reverent response to a gratuitous invitation, in which we see ourselves not as random utilitarian fabricators, more on that in a minute, but as delighted participants in an unceasing feast, lavishly set in the home of another. This dynamic way of life is what I mean by spiritual art. Now, as I move on to the second part of the thesis, let me underline something very important about modernity, this historical epoch in which we live. Modernity focuses on, we know this, data, right? Functionality, information, utility, control. And those things aren't necessarily bad. The problem is that modernity has made of those things a philosophical paradigm. The philosopher Esther Lightcap Meek calls it the spirit of technology. By that, she means that modernity rejects the real. Think of it like this. Imagine a lovely German cottage on a warm spring day, about 11 a.m. The sun shining through the windows of the empty house when a little girl strides up to the front door and finds it cracked. She enters. No one is home. First, she heads to the kitchen where she finds 3 bowls of porridge. One's too hot, one's too cold, one's just right. Contentedly full, she climbs the stairs and finds 3 beds. One's too hard, one's too soft, one's just right. Well, modernity is a little bit, the analogy breaks down if you really want to push it, but modernity is like the 3 bears in the fairy tale about Goldilocks. The baby bear, the softest form of modernity's technological spirit, is reductivism. Reductivism divests itself of the real. It breaks everything down to its bits. Philosopher R.J. Snell calls reductivism nothing but ism, a dismissive attitude towards whatever transcends our empirical experience. I am nothing but this assemblage of features. Snell points out that often those who have embraced nothing but ism, well, they live in a flattened world, kind of an existential pancake. But they seem content. They seem happy. They seem fulfilled more times often than the Christian or the person who has a transcendent frame of reference, who believes that there's more fullness to be had in life than clean air, clean skin, clean credit. Nothing but ism is this profoundly immanentized. There's a philosopher, Charles Taylor, who talks about the immanent frame. So if you imagine a great sweeping work of art, and then you impose a narrow frame on it so that you miss the great horizon and the depth. These are the Charles Taylor calls them the conditions of belief in a secular age. So it was really hard to be an atheist in 13th century Paris. It's really easy to be an atheist in Paris today. Why? Because the conditions of belief have changed. This is what he means by the immanent frame. Anyway, this is nothing but ism. That is an expression of that. Nothing but ism has spiritually anesthetized many of our contemporaries, and spiritual art that's open to the real, that sees itself as moving somewhere, has a role to play in waking modern people up to the malaise of petty desires and suburban satisfactions that so often paper over the yawning grave of the human heart. Then there's the mama bear, the medium form of the technological spirit, and this is what we call utilitarianism. Utilitarianism reduces things to, not to their bits, but to impersonal objects to be used. The father of modern liberalism, John Locke, in the 17th century, spoke this way of natural terrain. In his second treatise of government, Locke said that natural terrain, anywhere that it's not utilized for productive labor or use and exchange, is wasteland of little worth, just stuff. And in fact, this is why Esther Meek says that modernity doesn't have things anymore. This is really rich. Modernity doesn't have things, Meek says, it has stuff. I love this distinction. Things, Esther says, are jewels of the real. Things like the dish that Gina showed us on the slide, or really any of the things Gina showed us. Things are determinate signs that glitter with reality's generous invitation. Things bespeak reality. Things point to something. They move us thither. I love what Esther says about things. Things are real. They're coherent wholes. A thing is simple, she writes, held together in its ownness. It has its own particularity, a kind of interior incommunicability and unrepeatability. I'll explain this in a minute. A personal singularity. A thing is an irreducibly integrative whole that alone makes sense of its parts. So for example, Esther writes about a gorgeous blue and white china pedestal dish that she's got on her hutch up outside of Pittsburgh. She says that dish nobly and courteously invites our attention and involvement. Here I am, says the pedestal dish, at your service. A thing like that dish is nothing more and nothing less than just the thing it is. That pedestal dish is not a paper clip, nor is it a claw-footed tub. Its peculiar glory is being the pedestal dish that does nothing more than holds the strawberries and blackberries that it holds. If I'm disappointed in it for not holding together papers effectively, or for being too small to take a bath in, then I have reduced a thing to mere stuff. And this is what modern utilitarianism does. The third expression of the technological spirit, the Papa Bear form of modernity, is downright anti-realism. This could take the form of positivism, what the secularist philosopher Auguste Comte called the religion of humanity, or it may take the form of subjectivism. So this is, you know you're dealing with subjectivism, right, where you start to speak about reality in conversation with a friend and they say, wait, what do you mean, your reality or my reality? Subjectivism, anti-realism. So what each of the three bears, Papa, Mama, Baby, have in common, reductivism, utilitarianism, anti-realism, is that they aim above all at mastery. Mastery. And the thing about mastery, says historian Bill McClay, is that mastery suggests responsibility. Mastery suggests responsibility. In other words, if we can have control, because we are masters, we must. I think it's an important reason why in secular modernity, art so often degenerates into rationalistic activism. The deliverables of engineers executing orders from their project managers, not the handiwork of an apprentice who's been shaped by his elders. Modernity, with its moribund oppositions between art and use, reason and imagination, knowledge and creativity, rejects the real. Drawing on a tradition reaching back to the medieval theologian Thomas Aquinas, Esther Meek thinks that modernity's bleak cynicism is really just disappointment at being a creature. As Aquinas put it, it's just sadness at being. How different that is from what we're calling spiritual art. Modernity begins with absence, the absence of God, the absence of any meaning beyond myself, usually even the absence of me, until some brute force provokes a grievance or an impression which rouses some kind of reaction, and suddenly I exist. Spiritual art, by contrast, abides in radical attentiveness to the real. I mean, this is actually what Bickner was talking about in part of the quote that Dwight read here at the beginning. Spiritual art consents to the real. It is not sad to exist. The spiritual artist accepts the invitation to awed participation in the real world. Which brings us now to the briefer second part of my thesis. Spiritual art deliberately mediates God's fulfillment and judgment of the culture from which it springs. In his book, Western Culture and Gospel Context, David Kettle argues that when the gospel touches down in a person's life, it breaks open old categories, right? It reveals how God is at work fulfilling and judging my beliefs, my practices, my commitments. And Kettle says that the same thing happens when the gospel touches down in a culture. It breaks open old categories. It reveals how God is at work fulfilling and judging the beliefs, practices, and commitments that are embraced in our cultural world. And Kettle says that when the gospel transforms a culture, therefore, it produces a far more thoroughgoing conversion than simply what we say with our lips. It transforms our symbols, our language, our systems of thought, our core beliefs. So culturally, that means that when the gospel touches down, it shapes, transforms so much more than just, our Sunday mornings. It critiques, for example, individualism and totalitarianism, converting us to a vision of society as a communion of persons under God. It critiques the way we pursue knowledge, converting us from an objectifying utilitarianism to a posture of radical attentiveness to what's independent of us. It critiques a mentality of scarcity, converting us to a mentality of abundance. It critiques the ideology of rights, converting us to a culture of life and dignity, and so on. In all these ways and more, the gospel fulfills and judges the signs by which we're governed. And spiritual art participates in this work in a vital way because spiritual art mediates that judgment through signs. That's what art is, signs. symbols of reality. Now, spiritual art, the spiritual artist can do this accidentally, right? God is sovereign. He doesn't need my permission to use a poem to stir something in you that I didn't intend, or your plaster work or painting or whatever it might be. But the spiritual artist, my point is, doesn't only sort of submit to that possibility, he or she actively desires it, deliberately desires it. The question is how the spiritual artist can move from being a quivering mass of good intention, like, oh, maybe God can use my art, to become a deliberate mediator of the gospel's fulfillment and judgment of cultural beliefs, practices, and commitments. And to do so in a way, again, that doesn't just descend into rationalistic activism or kind of kitschy religious art. Do you see what I mean? Which brings us to the final part of the thesis. Spiritual art, this way of life open to, ordered towards the real, deliberately mediates God's fulfillment of and judgment of culture, mediates the transforming power of the gospel, when and only when its makers get our epistemology right. Epistemology, what is that? Epistemology is the study of how we know. So metaphysics, ontology, looks at being itself, the real itself. Epistemology examines how we know the real. And spiritual art, it turns out, has a vital epistemological role. It has everything to do with how we know the real. How so? According to philosopher D.C. Schindler, it is the privilege of the spiritual artist to participate in what Schindler calls the first gift. That is the gratuitous gift of God's presence in the universal gift of being. As we've seen, spiritual art does this by co-enacting creation in a way that, as I said, is appropriate to our creatureliness. But Schindler goes on to say something further and of great importance. And this, by the way, applies in so many other areas of our life, not just in the realm of artistry. The first gift of life, being. The first gift has always and from the beginning been meant as an invitation to the second gift, namely participation in the inner life of God, which comes through our adoption as sons and daughters in Christ. If it is the privilege of all spiritual art to mediate the first gift by co-enacting God's creative act, to do spiritual art in gospel context is to participate in the mediation of the second and greater gift to which all spiritual art invites us, that relation of adopted sonship into which our daily experience of the sparkling, lively real always constitutes a gracious summons and a loving invitation. So again, I'm not saying that spiritual art must necessarily become Christian art. What I am saying is that the reception of the first gift inclines us to desire the second. This, I think, is what Arjikovsky means when he says the spiritual art is a particular way of living by producing forms oriented towards their higher purpose. The point being, spiritual art beckons us deeper. The first gift summons us to the second. And I'm aware that I may have raised a question, especially if we're not Christians. If some art is spiritual art, does that not mean that other art is like unspiritual art? Is it not elevating some art and sort of denigrating the rest? And that's a fair question. Do I have a couple of minutes left to go, or should I wrap up here? 2 minutes. All right, let's do it. So what I want to do is just quickly to sketch a framework for how to relate spiritual artistry to other artistic frameworks. So turning back to Sedekov and Arjikovsky, for Arjikovsky, spiritual art can be discerned from classical, modern, and postmodern art by understanding that we can think of each of them as a level of consciousness, which is open to reality, to the lively real in a certain way. He quotes a document called the 1994 Charter of Transdisciplinarity, which has nothing to do with the modern trans movement. Obviously, it has to do with working across disciplines. And there, an important principle was laid down. That document argues that the real is structured by levels of reality which answer to particular levels of consciousness. No single form of logic exhausts the real. That's a super abstruse idea. What the heck does that mean? It means that classical, modern, and postmodern and spiritual art need to be seen as expressing different forms of artistic consciousness. So very quickly, if I move us here, I'm going to show you some good examples of a kind of transformation in classical consciousness. Think about the High Gothic Cathedral, which was very much like a great work of medieval theology, Aquinas' Summa Theologica. There's a place for everything, everything in its right place. Let me show you this picture of a late medieval cathedral. This is the Marienkirche in Pirna in Germany. You can see how there's like a delight in fusing various styles promiscuously, right? You can see how the almost like duck-footed way in which the pillars move to the segmented vaulted ceiling. But compare this now to the High Gothic Cathedral of Amiens. Let's get inside. And actually here, what you'll begin to see is that unlike the late Gothic Marienkirche, Amiens demands that we be able to infer from one individual part the design of the whole, a bit like a crystalline structure. This is even clearer if you were to look at the floor plan. It's like a masterwork of scholastic theology rendered in architectural form. There's a keen sense in the classical artistic consciousness that God is the creator and he has created an orderly creation. Now, for modern consciousness, art becomes, Arjakovsky says, the outlet of a deified ego. If classical consciousness reflected medieval Christianity, modern consciousness reflects something of the Reformed emphasis, so associated with Calvin, that the invisible God cannot be envisaged by created form. And that connection of Reformed theology to non-representative aesthetics can be seen in many artists with a Reformed background, like Hans Arp here, his piece Crucifixion. Postmodern art differs from both, rejecting especially the modernist sacralization of art. Now, there's something to commend here. There's a rejection of objectification. It's not reductivist in that sense. But postmodern consciousness achieves this at the cost of a strong anti-realism, and Duchamp's Fountain here is a good example. It shows well how anti-realism cannot but degenerate into a kind of self-conscious activism and even the kind of crassest commercialization. There's really, you don't have to move far from Fountain to the Louis Vuitton bag illuminated in the window. Once we see these, I'm going to draw to a close quickly. We can see how spiritual consciousness doesn't repudiate what's good and right in the other forms. Rather, it alone, spiritual consciousness, has the resources to affirm what is right in the other. So I'm going to actually move us through. I was going to give us several examples of architecture here, the Urbino panel as representative of the classical form, the golden section, the golden ratio is the organizing principle here. Ludwig what's his name? Mies van der Rohe. And the Chicago Federal Center here is representing the modern style. The Abu Dhabi Louvre of Jean Nouvel, and then the National Museum of Qatar is representative of the postmodern. I'll just skip through those to get to what I really love, which is Jean-Marie Dutilleux, a French architect. This is the parish, it's a Roman Catholic parish, obviously, of Saint-François de Molitor, which was built in 2005. And one that I love even more is the Church of Saint-Martin in Tours, which I think is absolutely splendid. And I hoped to be able to hold up for you here the idea that spiritual architecture, what it's ultimately out to do, is to make present, not to establish any particular relationship. And I think it's that goal of acknowledging relation, a framework of relatedness, which allows us, particularly if we are Christian artists, to be able to take in far more than we keep out from a cultural and artistic standpoint. So I'm going to be done. Let me actually wrap up with one sentence, just so I don't leave us hanging. As Christians, we have received a wonderful recognition that spiritual art, which participates in the first gift of being, stands as a constant invitation to the second and greater gift of participation in the life of God as his adopted sons and daughters, to receive that second gift and thus to become instruments mediating divine transformation and judgment through symbols and signs of culture is what it means to do spiritual art in gospel context. Thanks. Sorry for going over.